So the P6 has been out for a little while now, and it's been getting quite a lot of usage in the studio. But with so much crammed into this little beast, it can be a bit overwhelming. So today we're going over 6 tips to help you make the most out of everything the P6 has to offer, and also how to optimize its form factor for faster navigation. Timestamps are in the description. Let's get into it. So granular synthesis creates small little segments out of the audio or the sample that you're using, and these segments are then called grains. They could be from 1 to 100 milliseconds long typically, and they're played back in a ton of different ways, such as overlapping, being stretched, rearranging. The P6 has a granular engine packed into this tiny little button right here called granular, and it's actually a 7th sample pad, and the settings for granular can be saved per pattern, so you can have a ton of different sounds. So we'll take this guitar and we'll set that to the granular. You just hold pattern granular and then press the pad that you want to set. I want just that one chord. So I'm changing the start and end of the granular. So instead of that full loop, I'm just using the end to just capture kind of that one sound. And then if you go into shift voice, this is how we did that chop earlier. You can move and you'll find a whole new set of options, all kinds of stuff. We're going to keep spread to 0 though. We'll change the grains to be slower. Actually, we'll make the grains faster. That's perfect. And then if we wanted to, we could add effects. We can add the delay and reverb. If we first go into shift mixer, we can do some delay and we can do some reverb. Then we can change the delay and reverb, which we'll get into. And that's our sound. Now, if you want to play it polyphonically on the keyboard, just hit the keyboard. And there we go. So you can even do chords on it. And then we can also add these effects. If you want a full breakdown on all of the settings, we went through it pretty quickly. Check out that video. So resampling is the process of sampling a sound that's already in your P6, but this time with added effects, filters, pitch changes, all the kind of stuff that a sampler offers for tweaking sounds. Now, the P6 is very similar to the SB404 if you're familiar with it, in that it's got 5 effects that are easily accessible, and then it's got a bunch of other effects if you just hold down the M effects. So we can add some of that to a sound, which is how I did the guitars in that first song. So if we check out this guitar here, if we turn on a keyboard, I've chopped it, and that's how I made this main riff. So we're gonna go into the sample mode. 5 on bank H is empty, so we're gonna choose 5, and we're gonna set a measure of 4 because this pattern is synced with BPM, and so I want it at the 4 bars. Then we're gonna go to the threshold, and this is a noise threshold that the sound in the P6 must meet before it starts getting recorded. This is just helpful if you've got like vinyl noise and things like that. It won't catch and start recording until you start the actual sound. So from there, I'm actually gonna drop the sample rate, and I'll put up here a list of the duration you get per sample rate. Since we've got 4 bars, we could probably get away with 14, but we're actually going to do the 11. I did add lo-fi. We could add crusher too instead. From there, we're going to arm it by hitting sample, and then we're going to hit play and it'll start recording. And now it did the 4 bars. It's going to normalize, and then it's going to write. And the keyboard can act as a sort of meter for a lot of things. You could see it was showing the noise, but let's hear the original. Check this one out. Let's actually up the level. So listen, that sample rate really gave it a lot of grit and took out some high end. And then that lo-fi just completely gritted it up. So what we could do from there though is then go in and let's do a chop. So if we go shift voice, we can go from tune to detune to chop. Because this is a long one, we probably wanted to actually do like 32 or something, but just for the sake of this example, we're gonna chop it into 16 steps. Now check this out. If we turn on the keyboard, you'll see it's all lit up, and that's because something else we could do, let's up that pitch, maybe 12. Let's do like 4. This is what happens with sampling and with resampling. You can just take an idea, even if you're not really vibing with it, resample it, do some crazy effects to it, and then chop it up and you'll see the difference. The reason this technique works so well is you can add texture, you can create vintage vibes on any sound you're throwing in, but you can also, just like we just did, create something completely new. And if you want a breakdown of all of the available effects, what they do, and the best ones for resampling and any other parts in the P6 workflow, check out my brand new P6 cheat sheet. It's an easy to reference guide that covers every setting and feature from sampling to MIDI integration and the powerful Granular Engine. Moving on, let's get into something a little more complicated, and that's per step sequencing. So this is where you can really fine tune, but also add emotion, velocity changes, humanization to anything you record into the sequencer. Of course, you've got quantize so you can set things to the grid, but if you want to just get a little humanization, less robotic sounding and stuff, you can do per step changes to anything. So let me just show you really quickly. If we go to a new pattern, we're going to just find a hi-hat and we'll go and just program these. So yeah, a little boring. We can of course go in and add some shuffle, but it's pretty robotic, right? But what we can do, let me add a kick real quick just so we have something going on underneath. It's okay, right? Like it's fine, it'll work if we start adding sounds, but we can really change things around a lot. Let's go back to that hi-hat. Now, if you hold a note, this is per step changes. By hitting the granular when you're holding a note, you get all these other options. So you can change the actual note. So we could go maybe up an octave, up to, let's say, C5. Hear how it's now a little different. And then we can go into that second one. Let's drop the velocity a ton, and that's going to change the volume. And we're actually going to go into every other main one and we're going to change the velocity. This just adds some variety, some velocity changes. It's very helpful. We're going to drop those little additional shuffle ones down even more. And then on this one, not only are we going to change the velocity a little bit, we could change some other settings. We're going to go to the substep and we're going to add some substep or ratchets. And let's do maybe that. And we still got this one that we're going to drop the velocity to. So let's hear what that sounds like now. So now we're getting a lot more movement and it's a little less dry sounding. Now the other thing we can do, we talked about shuffle already, that gives a little groove, a little movement, but we can actually go in and change the micro timing. Just for example, I'm going to show how off we can make that first one because you'll hear it compared to the kick. We'll fix it in a minute, but we'll go in and change some of these other ones as well. And at the end, I'll show you a very similar pattern without any changes so we can kind of compare what it's doing. Okay, now let's check it out. Now this one's going to be really off, just for example. Hear how the kick almost completely hits before this one even comes on? Let's put that pitch back so you can really hear it a little more clearly. See, it's like very delayed. I actually kind of like that though. Okay, so this is it dry without any of the changes that we made in terms of the per step. It's serviceable, but now let's hear it with these changes we made. It has so much more groove, so much more movement. Again, the original, everything's the same velocity, everything's just hitting on time, very robotic. And back to the new one. You can also do things like we talked about, changing pitch notes so you can get some really cool bass sounds, or if you make a mistake, if you're performing on these tiny little keys, you can then go in per step and fix it by going in, changing the note, changing the velocities, all that type of stuff. This is great for just adding variation and dynamics to the track, really getting groove, shuffle, but you can use it on melodic sounds as well. All right, next up we've got per pad filters, pitch, and other effects. So the P6 allows you to tweak individual samples with per pad filters, pitch adjustments, and individual delay and reverb sends. Now we have to stress the sends because the delay and the reverb are going to be the same delay and reverb for every pad, but you can change the dry and wet on each pad. So this is really helpful because you can do a little bit of mixing and just filter sounds and things like that per pad. You're not limited like you are on the SP where you can only use a filter on bus effects. And so you have to send every pad that you want into that and it's set with the one thing. So in this way, it's very helpful for doing some mixing. So let's go over it really quickly. Let's find that guitar sample. So this guitar sample was originally in drop A, very low tuning on the guitar. So it's got a lot of bassy low end, but because the song was lo-fi and boom bap, there's a lot of bass frequencies coming from the bass and from the kick drum. So I needed to mix it a little bit, and I didn't get to do it when I recorded the sample in, which you could also do with Isolator, but we can do it in post. And there's a couple other really cool tricks you can use the filters for, and I'll show you that in a second. So let's go to this sample. We're gonna go to Shift G sharp, which is your filter. And first you're gonna set your type. So because I wanna cut out low end, I'm gonna do a high pass filter. Then we go to cutoff. You can hear a lot of low end there. But as we get higher, you can hear how much is being taken off. I mean, that's just like a tinny little sound at that point. We had it at 100. Then you can also tweak the resonance. Upping the resonance on a high pass filter, you're actually gonna emphasize the low end. I know it sounds kind of counterintuitive. You would think if you're cutting off the low end with the high pass filter, with the cutoff, we're bringing it up, so we're cutting the low end out. But when you bring in the resonance, it's creating a peak at that bottom part, and that's gonna amplify sounds there. So if you've got a sample and you can't get a good bass line for it, try doing this high pass trick with the resonance really high. You don't have to do max. Just test it out until you start hearing the bass frequencies come in. It's an easy way to get some bass, and I'll play a quick clip of a track where it sounds like there's a bass line, but it's actually just the sample. So we're gonna set that resonance back to 0 because this is meant to be a low cut. We're cutting that low end off. So there we go. If you've got a sound that's got a lot of high end and you don't want it, like maybe a hi-hat if you're going for lo-fi, or just this sound that's got some really high-pitched sounds on it, we can then go back to filter, and we can turn on a low pass filter, and we can go to the cutoff, and now you can hear it's basically gone. But as we start bringing it up, you can hear it come out. There it is. Now what we're gonna do is, again, play with that resonance to get some really interesting harmonics coming out. Let's up that resonance a lot. Let's play with that cutoff a little bit. Now it'd be really nice if this filter had an LFO, but that's okay, we don't have that. And let's turn on that drum sound we had. Let's up it to maybe 128. Here we go. I like to use this when it comes to drum sounds, so I can kind of make things fit, like a snare. Maybe I don't want a lot of low end, so I can cut that out. And then bass, maybe you don't want a lot of high end, so roll off in a low pass filter. So I mentioned delay and reverb sends, and this is huge, and that's because I can set individual delay and reverb. So all you got to do for that is first go into Mixer and actually activate the send delay and send reverb before you can then change the settings of the delay and reverb. So I already have these at some pretty high settings on this sound. We can then go shift delay reverb. You can change all the settings of the delay, all the settings of the reverb, and then the sends is how you can control the dry wet per pad. But when it comes to the delay and reverb, you can use this to give a little room sound to, let's say, snare and hi-hats, to make it kind of sound more like a human drummer again, or just kind of like you're capturing a room sound. But then you can send a lot of your melodic sounds into the wet signal so that you can get some lush decay on, let's say, a melody. Next up is organization when it comes to your samples. So this is a very tiny box, and I've run into some limitations when it comes time to perform jams on it because, well, you only have the 6 main pads here, which you can mute by just holding shift, and then you can turn them back on. But you can also mute whole banks by pressing the banks. Now, one thing with that is there's only 4 buttons, but there's actually 8 banks. So to mute banks A through D, if you're in any of A through D, then you can just instantly mute it right away, and you can see the color goes off. So you can hear A is my drums, or most of my drums. Now they're muted, but I can bring them right back. If I wanted to mute E through H, I'd have to tap or double tap a bank so that it goes into the blinking light. Then we can mute those. So with this kind of limitation, I've been thinking a lot about how to organize tracks, because I like to do a lot of beat performances in terms of I make a beat and then I want to jam out to it using the P6, add effects, you know, play things on top, things like that. But I also do beat performances or beat sets using this. So there's a couple things when it comes to organizing your samples that you want to think about. And I'm just going to share what workflow works for me. And if you've got a different one, let me know in the comments. But what I do is I like to keep all of my drum sounds on banks A through D, because when I'm performing, I like to do a lot of mutes on drums or have no drums and then bring it in. You could also, of course, have multiple patterns. You can't pattern chain those, so you'd have to go in by hand and change them. But to get to patterns, it can be kind of clunky. So I like to just kind of do it this way, where you're just muting things and bringing them back in. And then on E through H, I like to have my melodic sounds, my samples, all of the chops, all of that type of stuff. I'm not doing as many mutes on that, but if I need to mute individual instruments or bring, like, let's say a piano lead that's only in the chorus, I can quickly just tap one of those and mute it, bring it back, all that type of stuff. That's how I like to do it. Again, let me know in the comments your takes. Lastly, this is a little more advanced, but this is very useful and one of, I think, the biggest features on the P6. Because it was something on the SP202, the 303, that's not on the 404 Mark II, and really I wish was, and that's sample rates. So we talked about that a little bit when we were sampling that original pattern. You get multiple sample rates that give different lengths of time you can sample because you do have time limitations per pad, but the sample rates also add a lot of color, and you can do some really cool things if you mess with the pitch of a sample. Let's take this sound, and we're gonna do another round of resampling. So we're gonna take this, we're gonna shut off that chop, go back to 0. On this sound, we already did a lower sample rate in that first tip, but what we're also going to do is add crusher. This is getting real gritty. Then what I'm actually gonna do, we were playing on 4. So I'm gonna go to 16. We're gonna up the pitch to 16. Now it just sounds crazy, right? We got like chiptune drum and bass or something, but what we're gonna do is resample that, and I'm gonna drop the sample rate to 14.7. Actually, let's do 11, that's fine. And we're gonna sample this in, we're gonna tap this, arm it, gonna normalize. Now you can see we got it even more gritty sounding because we dropped the sample rate again. But now what I want to do, we're going to drop that pitch down 12. And then let's go into that filter. We're going to bring this all back together. We're going to do a high pass. We're going to cut out a lot of that mud. It really is just a way to get longer durations, but you can use it, as you can see, to get some really gritty, nasty sounding samples or effects. If you mess with pitch, try upping the pitch before you resample and then drop the pitch. It's worth trying on guitar and stuff like that because you can get some really interesting artifacts on it. So those are 6 ways to get the most out of your Roland P-6 for beat making. There's a lot in this box, so I hope this helps to see all the different ways you can use it. I mean, we're barely scratching the surface for some things. There's a lot you can do with envelopes, pitch envelopes, all that type of stuff, motion, which we did a little bit of, but there's a ton more. So if there's more you want me to get into, more advanced settings and things like that, let me know in the comments. If you found it helpful, leave a like, drop a comment with whatever your favorite tips are for the P6, whether I covered it or if you think I missed something. And the samples from this video will be up for channel members at the Solar Sailor tier. It's the best way to help support the channel, but just hanging out is more than enough. And so we've covered a lot of ways to make the most out of the P6, but if you want to check out a workflow for actually making those beats with the P6, check out this video next. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.